Lee Lowe, as I said earlier, if you weren't here, is probably the center of the orbit of the Houston Peace Movement for many, many years. Houston Peace News. And she's also been the house that hosted all our planning meetings. And it's like this is Lee's conference as well as all of ours. So thank you, Lee.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, when I got sick, I said, I can't do any of this. I put it in the email, but I didn't call Bob on the phone. And so I'm going to introduce you to, again, our second time that we listened to David Swanson. And I'd like to also tell you that if you wanted to hear even more of him, or if some of you missed him earlier today, you can go to Wally James' radio show on KPFT, and 2 weeks ago he had David on, and he was great. And David, I think one of the things that I'm really impressed about is he has called on sent a letter to Gorbachev asking him to call a peace conference for the world, and that will be a possibility of trying to prevent this dangerous baiting of countries that our country is doing, and those that have nuclear weapons. And I think he's got a real creative mind, and I think that's something we really need in the peace movement. The other thing he has written a book, a small book, I don't see it out there though, on a global security system, a way to avoid war. I'm getting it wrong, but anyway, something like that. And I think that, again, that's his creative thinking and looking ahead. His website, he has many. One is War is a Lie, and the book is out for you to buy. And he also has World Beyond War. If you said world without war, that sort of ends it. But beyond war means you have a vision of something better. David Swanson.
Now I'm going to try to set this thing up that I tried to set up earlier when I didn't need it, and now I do. Let's see. For those of you who weren't here earlier, there are peace activists in Afghanistan who have encouraged the wearing of sky blue scarves because we all live under the same blue sky as a symbol of wanting to end war. And I'm selling the scarves as well as the books. And the thing that we carefully set up early this morning is now replaced by this. So I wonder if I can go backwards on this to where it was before. No. So I love getting more credit than I deserve. I'm not against that. But I did not write a letter to Gorbachev. What I did was promote and get a good English translation of a letter that was drafted by numerous members of the Parliament of Germany and very prominent figures in Germany who wrote a letter to Gorbachev urging his attention to the U.S. and NATO aggression in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and something that probably the media that we just had a nice critique of didn't tell you about, that there are these sorts of thoughts about U.S. behavior in places like Germany. I also did not write a global security system, but I and a few dozen other people with input from many dozens more, as this organization, World Beyond War, wrote this book that's just come out called A Global Security System on Alternative to War, that lays out sort of what the structures and systems legally and politically and economically would look like in a world that didn't use war, how we would avoid conflicts and settle conflicts, because we, of course, would not avoid all conflicts. And I'm sorry I don't have copies of that, but if you go to worldbeyondwar.org, you can buy the paperback, get the free PDF, get the audiobook, get the ebook, etc. It's it's a good answer when people have this question, well, what would you do instead of war? So I basically want to talk here briefly about another ideological assumption, another filter that things go through in U.S. discourse. And you can tune into U.S. news reports and very, very frequently hear discussions of the next wars, how things are going to be different or better, or different weaponry or different tactics in the next wars, as if there simply must be next wars, as if it's not an option, as if the war is just going to continue. We've heard it on panels today. We hear it. This is an assumption that Chris hedges for all the wonderful work he does, and most peace activists and most people in the United States of America believe that some wars are good, some wars are necessary. You can't just do away with the entire institution. That's going a little bit overboard. So it's okay to laugh at the idea of having just child abuse or philanthropic slavery or humanitarian rape. But if you take the institution of war, which is the worst institution we've ever created, and criticize it entirely as a whole, like, let's replace it, let's abolish it, let's have a world without it, that's getting too extreme. That's not permissible. So, Al Jazeera is coming out with a new good program, and I'm on it debating this topic on their premier show. And the U.S. television networks I seem to be on very infrequently, and I always change the debate from this type of war to abolish the whole thing, and then they seem to lose my contact information. And so if you are watching this on YouTube, MSNBC, check with the NSA. They've got my phone number. We have set up at worldbeyondwar.org what we intend as a website to be a useful tool for anybody who's thinking through this question, disagrees with our perspective, or is coming at it from whatever angle. And one of the ways we do this is to address numerous myths, and these are just 3 examples of numerous myths. So there is this idea that war is inevitable, that you can't do away with it. And of course this is nonsense. Most of the existence of most Homo sapiens who have ever lived on this planet have known nothing to remotely resemble war. It has been sporadic in human history. It has been done away with by societies that used it, and they've abandoned it for centuries. Some brought it back, some not. Most people do not want any part in war, even in countries that engage in it, including ours. Gallup did a poll at the end of last year, and of course they did not ask, and will never ask again, what country is the greatest threat to peace on earth. But they did ask, would you fight for your country in a war? And they didn't specify what kind of war, for what purpose, or anything. But in many countries, you have 60, 70% saying, no, I wouldn't. 80, 90% in some cases, no, I would not fight for my country in a war. In the United States, you had a majority saying yes. Now, it's not as if there aren't wars. It's not as if the recruitment stations aren't open, right? These people, thank goodness, are all lying. But they live in a culture where they think that's the good answer. They live in the same culture as Bill O'Reilly and Brian Williams and gang, and they say, yes, I would participate in a war. But in fact, most people resist it. Most people who are forced to take part in it do not actually take part in it. It takes great conditioning to get someone to take part in a war, and many people never recover after having done so. And there is, to this date, not a single recorded case of PTSD from war deprivation. It has not been found. So to this idea that it's natural, that it's in our genes, that it's in our economy, that, our economy is brand new compared to war, which is extremely new in the history of our species and prehistory of our species. So it's not inevitable. And when you look at any particular case of war and the chaotic decision-making that leads to the war instead of non-war, or you look at the cases where war is stopped, like Syria 2013, and then the cases where they get it going, like Iraq and Syria 2014, it's a question of very human decisions that could go one way or the other. There's no inevitable force about it. And the idea that it's necessary, well, It's not necessary. It's never a last resort. You had George W. Bush with Tony Blair in the White House coming up with the most cockamamie schemes for how to get a war going with Iraq. Let's paint a plane with UN colors and fly it low and try to get it shot at, and then we can start a war. And walking out to the press corps, my accurate pronunciation, and saying, we are trying to avoid war. We're doing everything we can to avoid war. We're not going to go to war unless we have to as a last resort, and it's necessary. Well, it's never necessary. And they were lying. And not a single one of those so-called journalists that was blatantly lied to has ever asked for an apology or shown any sort of offense whatsoever. Beneficial. This is, you now have almost every U.S. war marketed to two different groups simultaneously. Right? It's marketed to a certain section of the U.S. population as the necessary resistance to evil, dark-skinned Muslim foreigners who are going to kill us all and bring Ebola-infested Korans over from Honduras if we don't slaughter them. And simultaneously marketed to another section of the population as an act of philanthropy, as bringing democracy and stability to these poor people who need it. So you actually 2 years ago had libertarians saying, let's not attack Syria because they won't even be grateful for it. The Iraqis aren't grateful for us destroying Iraq. Why should we spend money? And you had humanitarian warriors saying Syrians are just as good as you and I are. We should bomb them because we care about them. And so there's this, you get these confused arguments because you're marketing the same mass crime in two different ways. But it's not ever beneficial, right? I mean, Samantha Power at the UN is openly writing articles saying we will be better prepared to attack Syria if we conscientiously pay less attention to what attacking Libya did to Libya. It's always the next one that's going to be beneficial. Nobody's saying it was beneficial to Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or any of the past wars. So I think I've covered some of this. It is not in our genes. It is not natural. It is not permanent. It is absolutely not beyond our control, even in the U.S. empire, even with our corrupt system of elections and governance. We have the ability to prevent wars. We have to take it a step further and put in place alternatives. When we stop missile strikes into Syria that Seymour Hersh revealed was going to be a massive campaign of bombing Syria, and then don't engage in diplomacy and arms embargoes and ceasefires and humanitarian aid on appropriate scale and negotiations and regional cooperation and stop supporting the dictators in the region around. No, instead, we send in the CIA with guns and trainers and bide our time until better YouTube videos come along. That's a halfway step that shows that we can do it, but we don't do it far enough. Ending war is certainly possible. Ending blood feuds, ending duels, ending slavery to the extent that it has been ended, which is significant, ending all sorts of human evils has been declared impossible before it was done. There's never been any basis for such dramatic claims. Defense. War is not defensive. U.S. wars are offensive. And if you believed in military defense, and you wanted to have a coast guard and weaponry along the U.S. coasts, but you didn't carry it on to an offensive way of thinking, and you didn't have soldiers in 175 countries and ships in every ocean and weapons in outer space and so forth, you could get rid of 90% or more of the U.S. quote-unquote defense budget. And you would move the world dramatically in the direction of being able to get rid of war entirely. I mean, the arms races would reverse and so forth. Good wars. I mean, this is the myth that really upholds all of this. I mean, most audiences outside of peace groups, you can't even talk about this subject for 5 minutes without, are you against World War II? Am I against? I mean, there is no other institution on earth that is widely recognized as engaging in failure after failure after failure for 3/4 of a century, that appeals to some instance of its use 3/4 of a century back to claim legitimacy. Our number one public program, the thing that we dump the majority of public spending in, the thing we do as a society, is justified by an instance of its use 3/4 of a century ago in a completely different world that people allege was good. It was, in fact, the very worst thing this species has ever done to itself. This was a slaughtering of 50, 60, 70 million people. This was absolutely avoidable. There was absolutely no need to end World War I in a way that wise observers at the time predicted accurately would bring about World War II in exactly the way that it did. There was no need for Wall Street to fund Nazis for decades. There was no need to turn away all Jewish refugees. There was no need to take all the wrong steps leading up to a war and then to escalate that war in such a barbaric fashion and end it with absolutely unjustifiable nuclear slaughter and build an empire out of it in a way that it just has never ended. The troops have never left Europe or Japan. The spending and the taxes have never gone back. The militarism has never been scaled back. It's just never ended. It's expanded into an ongoing U.S. imperial victory celebration. And to suggest that there's something good about that, I mean, is perverse. But grant it to people. Let them say, let them defend Jefferson owning slaves because that was what was done in his day. But let Roosevelt make wars because that was what was done in his day. But no further than that. I mean, it need not be done in our day. We have alternatives. We know the people who resisted the Nazis in Rosenstrasse and demonstrated the power of nonviolent activism there didn't know how to continue it. We do. We know the power of nonviolence. We know alternatives to this madness. We live in a very different era in which no one is doing colonialism the way that it was done in the 1930s and 40s. So preparing for war, as Eisenhower warned us, is not defensive. It generates the momentum for the wars. There are ways to defend a society without violence, including nonviolent, non-cooperation, the rule of law. And war, of course, does not make us safer. It makes us less safe. War does not benefit its victims. I mean, you hear this. I mean, I heard shades of this earlier today. There used to be this argument made, including by a guy named Barack Obama. We were reckless getting into Iraq, but we need to be very careful about getting out. We shouldn't pull out recklessly. Look, if I break into your house and smash half your furniture and kill half your children, I don't have a moral obligation to stay the night and be careful about leaving. I have a moral obligation to go down the street, turn myself in at the police station, right? So the idea that it benefits its victims, and you have a plurality of Americans in polls within the past few years saying Iraq benefited and is grateful. That madness has to just be debunked. It does not bring stability. Look at the Middle East. It does not benefit the aggressor nation. It does not allow us a better lifestyle. It does not allow us a better world. It is going to destroy our world if our lifestyle doesn't do it first. And its motives are not noble. I mean, this is the thinking of the ideology that we just heard about, that no matter how bad it is, we meant well. We adopting an identity with the U.S. military meant well in attacking this or that country. This is not borne out by what we know of internal discussions of war planners. I mean, you have discussions around escalating the Vietnam War where they had to get creative about concocting reasons for themselves to escalate a war that they were just going to escalate for no reason at all. And then a second step, figure out reasons to tell the public. I mean, the idea that there are noble motives among ordinary people who have been brought around to supporting a war. But the idea that the decision makers who are manipulating us into these wars have noble motives is ridiculous. There's just no evidence for it. Why end war? It's immoral, it endangers us, it threatens the environment, it erodes our liberties, it impoverishes us, and we need the $2 trillion a year for better things. So we go to each of these, and each of these is a section on the worldbeyondwar.org website. You know, it's funny, the only crime that war is supposed to legalize is murder, right? And this leads certain parts of our population to ask, well, then why not torture? You know, why not some other things? If it's okay to murder, why can't you do lesser crimes too? Well, because the civilized warriors want to keep it to murder. You cannot torture, you can't cheat on your taxes, I mean, nothing else is legalized, only murder. And it's a bizarre position because you have mass murder, close cousin of genocide. I mean, this distinguishing between war and genocide, as if war could be a tool to prevent something worse called genocide, you have to squint very, very hard, and the distinction is typically a question of who did it rather than what was done. It's mass murder, and you end up with this notion that smaller scale murder by drone, for example, in other countries where there wasn't something being called a war, gets legalized if some lawyer says it's part of a war somewhere. It's insane. You have the same act that from the ground looks like murder and from the aggressor's side looks like murder. It's either legal or not, depending on a secret memo in a drawer in the White House. That's ridiculous. Civilians, dead and injured and refugees. This is what war does. It is one-sided, and it of course has nothing to do with the rhetoric that describes it. That is at least 100 years out of date. It's not fought between fair teams with different colored jerseys on a battlefield somewhere. It's fought where people live. And it's fought against the people who live there. War endangers us. The war planning leads to war. When you have plans by accident and so forth, we are very lucky, in fact, to be here right now. But that luck will run out. I mean, statistically, we cannot keep creating nuclear energy and nuclear weaponry and proliferating it and expect to survive. And the other Gulf states that you don't hear about other than Iran, all the little dictatorships of the region, the United Arab Emirates and so on that are getting nuclear energy, are getting it because it is close to nuclear weaponry. And this is a very, very dangerous thing to be continuing. Wars are fought for fossil fuels. The obsession with the Middle East began with the need to fuel the British Navy. The British Navy was not created to fight for the fossil fuels. So there may be an answer to the chicken and egg problem here, but the wars consume huge amounts of the oil that they are fought over. The U.S. military would be, I think, number 38 in a list of nations, if it were a nation, in consumption of petroleum. And without it, the United States would still be far and away number one, but it would be a huge step back because the military is the biggest in consuming petroleum. Wars in our psychology associate destruction with machismo. So, you know, it's wimpy to use the sun or the wind or things that don't profit billionaires but fuel our needs. The wars are fought with the fossil fuels, and the military is our top destroyer, top creator of Superfund sites, top destroyer of islands used for bombing ranges, top creator of cancer epidemics, top poisoner of water. I mean, the military is the number one target that environmental groups would turn to in wanting to oppose environmental destruction, were it not for the flags and the war music and the patriotism. I love reminding people how John Wayne died. Anybody remember how John Wayne died? Somebody said cancer. Who gave it to him? Smoking. Cigarettes. Convenient for the military, but wrong. John Wayne avoided going to war by making pro-war films, just like the films that come out of the phone calls to Sony that the State Department just engaged in, right? That we saw the leaks. And while he was making one of these films downwind from a nuclear test site in the western United States, he and his colleagues and crew and the director and the other stars got cancer and died at 3 or 4 times the normal rate as a result of nuclear tests that were being widely used as human experimentation to see what would happen to the people who lived downwind of the nuclear tests. So you can run, but you can't hide. War erodes our liberties. It's just bizarre to me that people can associate war with freedom and talk about fighting wars for freedom just because you're bombing some place that has an abusive government or whatever, because we lose our freedoms under the banner of war. Whenever there's a war, they take away our freedoms in the name of the war. War is a justification for all of the secrecy, for all of the surveillance, for all of the stripping away of our legal rights and our free speech rights. It is the opposite of a force that brings freedom. Without the idea of a wartime enemy, how would they justify reading all of our emails and listening to all of our phone calls and violating our Fourth Amendment rights on a routine basis? This is the fundamental justification, is the war madness. War costs us financially. I better hurry up. It costs the aggressor nation. We think because we have people who work that we know, neighbors and friends and family who work in war industries and subcontractors of subcontractors, we think it creates jobs. It doesn't. For the same dollars spent on education or infrastructure or other peaceful industries, you get more jobs and better paying jobs to such a degree that you have enough money saved to retool and retrain, and nobody gets hurt in the process. It's a question of political will. War is destructive. It is not creative of economic goods. It increases inequality, it concentrates wealth, and it cannot continue at this rate. We need the $2 trillion for other things. I talked about this morning. The good that could be done the world for tens of billions of dollars outstrips the harm done by war. But the money is going into war. How to end all war? Security without war, the Abolish War campaign, the Resource Center. So these are parts of the World Beyond War website and campaign and things we're working on and have committees working on, and this is mostly a volunteer effort, and we welcome anyone's involvement to whatever extent you want to get involved. But there are nonviolent ways to handle tyranny and oppression and occupation that have proven themselves more effective than war, more effective than violence. The U.S. has made itself viewed as a threat to peace in the world. We can sit here and debate whether we're a global policeman or not, but the rest of the world doesn't want a global policeman, doesn't appreciate a global policeman, and isn't going to put up with it. If you only have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. This is the United States government only having a military. We need disarmament. We need to stop the weapons dealing. We need to start negotiating. We need to reform or replace international institutions to establish structures that facilitate peace. This is a partial list of an endless list of good campaigns and steps and projects and acts you can take to move in the direction of ending war. There is a resource center at worldbeyondwar.org/resource center with all kinds of tools. And this is a statement that many of you have signed today on a piece of paper, and if you haven't, you can find one on a table outside, or you can sign it on the website, worldbeyondwar.org. But we are very happy that this has taken off in just the past year and a little bit, and people in 117 countries, thousands and thousands of people have signed this, and many well-known people, and we're going to enlarge that list and try to make persuasive news out of it. And this is now out of date, but we started this World Beyond War effort on the 100-year mark of starting the war that was going to be to bring us peace and end all war. And we think it's about time to try using peace to end all war instead of using war to end all war.
What can you get
we will not watch that too loud video. But if I have 2 minutes, I can take questions for 2 minutes.
Not a peace president, Nobel Peace Prize winner.
Uh-huh.
Why wasn't he able to change the climate in Washington? Why wasn't he able to stand up?
Well, there's an assumption that the question is, why wasn't Captain Peace Prize able to change the climate in Washington when he became president? And I think there's an assumption built in there that he tried that is certainly debatable. There are at least 3 verifiable incidents of him expressing blatant cowardice, fear of being killed by the military-industrial complex. In one case, explicitly the fear of being the next Kennedy, as he put it, which is, of course, understandable. But when you are in a position of sending thousands of people to kill and die kill tens of thousands of people and risk dying themselves, you actually have a responsibility to risk your life or get into another line of work. The pressures are intense. I mean, you can look at one instance where he is trying momentarily to avoid a war, namely with Iran, because he wants Iran to work with him on one of his other wars, namely the one against ISIS. And there are huge pressures within his administration and the military and the Congress, and we've talked about the corruption of the money and other influences that make that happen. But, I think the Nobel Committee would be well advised in the future to wait for someone to do something in line with Alfred Nobel's will before giving them a Nobel Peace Prize. And the fact that they gave Dr. King one before he did his work for peace, and then he did it after the fact, they may have gotten confused, and Barack Obama looked like Dr. King to them. I don't know, but it's not how it works. And they could have asked me, you, or anybody else, and we would have told them. And when Barack Obama gave the world's first pro-war Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, and he said there are many, many people more deserving than I am, he was right, and many of them are in this room and have been on this monitor, and I could name thousands of them. I think we need to do better with who we make heroes of and who we honor and what we honor, and whether we identify with and glorify an individual rather than a policy. So thank him for what he's doing on Iran and condemn him for what he's doing on 18 other countries.